and welcome back to Fuck That. Don't forget to hit subscribe so that way you never miss an episode. Today we're jumping into part 3 of the murder of Martha Moxley. When we left off in part 2, we talked about the investigation into Martha's murder and how it was already kind of circling the drain. The Skakels had lawyered up, they shut everything down, and the Greenwich Police Department basically said, yeah, this seems fine. The case went cold, and not because they ran out of leads, but because they ran out of guts. And for 15 years, nothing happened. Martha's killer was still out there, and nobody seemed particularly bothered by that. But in the early 90s, something happened that dragged all of this mess back into the spotlight. Another Kennedy with way too much power and zero accountability was accused of something awful. Shocking. And suddenly the world remembered the name Martha Moxley. So I want to talk a little bit about what Michael Skakel did in between that period of time. Michael went to Curry College in Massachusetts, and he got a bachelor's degree in English. Throughout the 1980s, he was in and out of rehab facilities, eventually becoming sober sometime in his 20s. As I mentioned at the end of part 2, he tried out in the 1992 Winter Olympics as a speed skier, and in 1991, he married pro golfer Margot Sheridan, and the pair had a child. The irony is not lost on me that he married a pro golfer and the murder weapon was a golf club. A little bit of drama between Michael Skakel and the Kennedys. He worked as a driver in Ted Kennedy's re-election campaign in 1994, then worked for Michael Kennedy, who ran the nonprofit Citizens Energy Corp., which was a nonprofit located in Boston. Skakel and Kennedy had a disagreement. Kennedy ultimately ended up firing Skakel. And allegedly, Skakel then intentionally leaked papers that proved that Kennedy was having an affair with the babysitter who was 14 years old when it started. Michael Kennedy, by the way, is RFK Jr.'s brother. So after Skakel was fired, he moved from Massachusetts to Florida, and then in 1997, Michael Kennedy passed away in a skiing accident. So Martha's case was cold for some time. It was out of the public eye. Once Dorothy had started working with Len Levitt, the journalist I mentioned at the end of part 2, things began to change, but not without a push from this other incident. Levitt was the first journalist to speak with Dorothy in length about Martha's murder, and while he was investigating, he eventually came to the realization that there really wasn't any information available regarding the case. So he sued Greenwich PD for the release of records. But the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission decided that Chief Keegan would be the one to examine the case file to determine what would be disclosed. Levitt eventually received documentation, but it was heavily redacted. Thankfully, though, they were a bit helpful. They contained information that they didn't previously have. Levitt would end up writing a story on Martha's murder, which initially the Greenwich Times refused to publish, but luckily, when her case was brought back into the spotlight, this would kind of change things. Interestingly enough, the person that would bring this case back to the spotlight would be William Kennedy Smith, Bobby Kennedy's nephew and cousin to the Skakel children. William Kennedy Smith was born September 4th, 1960. He is an American physician and the founder of Physicians Against Landmines, which is an organization that focused on the rehabilitation of landmine victims. His philanthropy kind of feels really performative, however, because this man is also a serial rapist, allegedly. In the spring of '91, Kennedy Smith was accused of rape in Palm Beach, Florida. According to an affidavit from Detective Christine Rogolo from Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, there were taped statements that were obtained from the victim and witnesses, as well as other evidence in this case. According to that affidavit, this is the sequence of events that night. Sometime after midnight on March 30th of '91, the victim met Kennedy Smith at a nightclub called Ah Bar in Palm Beach, Florida. They chatted, they danced together for a bit. Kennedy Smith introduced the victim to his uncle, Senator Edward Kennedy, as well as his cousin Patrick Kennedy. As it became closing time at the bar, Kennedy Smith told the victim that he did not have a ride home, which seems weird for a Kennedy, and asked her for a ride to the Kennedy estate. So she obliged and said, yeah, I'll give you a ride home, no problem. When they got to the estate, she gave Kennedy Smith a kiss goodnight, and he asked her if she wanted to see the estate and take a walk down to the beach. So she said, okay. They chatted for a while on the beach, exchanged a kiss or two, but nothing beyond that happened with consent. Kennedy Smith then asked her to take a swim with him, but she declined. Kennedy Smith said he was going to go for a swim anyways, so he takes off his shirt, and according to the victim, when he began to remove his pants, she became super uncomfortable, and so she turned around and said that it was getting late and she was going to go home. According to her statement, she started walking up the stairs, and as her right foot was in the air about to hit the final step, it was grabbed. Her leg was grabbed. She managed to break free from Kennedy Smith's grasp, and she began to bolt across the lawn of the estate towards the pool. As she was running, she was tackled from behind. Kennedy Smith forced her onto her back and pinned her down using his body weight. Every time she would try to get up, he would slam her back down to the ground. Just for reference, she was 5'6" and around 130 pounds. Kennedy Smith was 6 feet tall and 180 pounds. He then raped her. She noted that she tried to fight him off multiple times, screaming no, stop, as loud as she could. She was hoping that somebody inside the house would come out to help her, especially because she knew for a fact that Senator Kennedy was in the home and knew that they were there. She eventually got free of Kennedy Smith and ran into the home. She explained that she did this because when they walked through the property to go to the beach, they walked through the inside of the home, so she at least got a quick glimpse of the layout of inside of the home. Once she got inside of the house, she was fearful that he would find her and harm her again, so what she did was she found a spot in the kitchen between a cabinet and an ice chest where she could hide, and her plan was to just kind of take a deep breath, gain her composure, and think of a plan to escape. While she was doing this, she noticed a red blinking light on a telephone that was on a shelf not far from where she was hiding. So she went for the phone, called her friend Anne, who was with her at the bar earlier that evening. She told her friend Anne that she had been raped and asked her to pick her up. Anne was at her home with her boyfriend Chuck, who had also heard the phone call, and the pair went to pick her up at the Kennedy estate shortly after 4:30 in the morning. As she was waiting for her friend to pick her up, she heard Kennedy Smith calling her name. She began to move through the house to leave, and he found her and grabbed her again. She said that Kennedy Smith pulled her into a room but let her go as he sat down in a chair. She said that she confronted him and said to him, "You raped me," and that he replied that he didn't rape her and that nobody would believe her anyway. She believed Kennedy Smith that nobody would believe her because that name has weight to it. She then went outside and attempted to leave. She said that she started her car, which was parked facing south, and backed the car eastward, but she was unable to get the car into gear and work the pedal because she was shaking so badly. She said that she let the car roll into another parking space facing north, and it's at that point that her friend Anne arrived with her boyfriend Chuck. According to the affidavit, she did not report the crime immediately because she feared that nobody would believe her. She also stated that she was hysterical after the assault and did not know what to do. So initially, she went to her friend's home, then later on she went to her own home, and then later on that morning she did call the rape crisis line. Detective Christine Regolo met with the victim at the sheriff's office, and she described her as wearing a large white t-shirt and white shorts, but she was not wearing any shoes. She was sitting on a couch at the sheriff's office with her legs drawn up to her chest in a fetal position, and she would panic at any quick movement in the room. She appeared to be emotionally frightened, distraught, and in shock, and she was physically shaking. She was transported to Humana Hospital in West Palm Beach, and a physical examination was performed, and evidence for a rape kit was obtained as well. It was noted that during the physical examination, she would become very withdrawn and frightened and would not permit the physician to touch her, but she would then calm down, regain her composure, and permit the physician to continue the exam. The affidavit also noted that they did a computer voice stress analysis as well as a polygraph test, and that there was no evidence of deception in either exam. Even though that's not admissible in court, they still decided to do it anyways. Kennedy Smith was arrested and charged with 1 felony count of sexual battery and 1 count of misdemeanor battery. He refused to give his account of the situation to police and refused to speak to police about it in any capacity. The case went to trial at the end of 1991, and during the trial, Judge Mary Lupo denied the prosecution's request to allow 3 women to testify that also claimed that Kennedy Smith had assaulted them between 1983 and 1988. According to Judge Lupo, it did not demonstrate the discernible pattern of behavior required by Florida law for introduction. On December 11th of 1991, after deliberating for 79 minutes, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, and another Kennedy walked free, as they always seem to do. Here's the thing about scandals, especially when it involves a name like Kennedy. When one Kennedy ends up in court, it doesn't take long before people start to wonder what the other Kennedy-adjacent skeletons are up to. So the second that William Kennedy Smith was accused of rape, reporters, attorneys, and gossip vultures started flipping through the Kennedy Rolodex, and buried somewhere in the back was the name Michael Skakel. And this time, the Moxleys weren't the only ones paying attention. On June 21st, 1991, 3 months after the rape, Leonard Levitt, the investigative journalist and walking thorn in Greenwich police's side, finally published his article titled "Moxley Murder Still Haunts Greenwich." And it laid out the obvious. Martha's case was never solved because too many powerful people made damn sure it would never be. Levitt's article was published by the Stamford Advocate and the Greenwich Times. So the article made the rounds, people talked, and the timing was a disaster for the Skakels. And in a shocking twist, Greenwich finally pulled its head out of its ass long enough to admit that maybe they should dust off the murder file they had buried under decades of incompetence and golf metaphors. On August 9th of 1991, Connecticut officials announced that Martha's case was officially being reinvestigated. And this time, the people that were running the show weren't just going to take the Skakel family at their word and whatever else they were giving to them. 2 names got put on the case: Detective Frank Garr from Greenwich Police and Jack Solomon from the state's attorney's office. Unlike the previous jokes who stumbled their way through the original investigation, Garr and Solomon weren't sucking up to the Skakels. Regardless of the new faces on the case, though, Dorothy was not putting all of her faith into law enforcement again, rightfully so. So she increased the reward for information leading to an arrest from $20,000 to $50,000, and this money was coming out of her own pocket, by the way. And she paid for a toll-free tip line that rang directly to the investigator's office. Part of the investigation getting reopened would obviously entail reviewing physical evidence, and unfortunately, there was really not a lot to begin with based on how poorly the crime scene was handled initially. However, Dr. Henry Lee and a team from the Connecticut State Police Crime Lab began to review what was left of the physical evidence. And they spent 2 years examining it, 2 years trying to pull anything usable from a crime scene that was trampled on, contaminated, and basically treated like a neighborhood Halloween decoration. In October of 1993, they submitted their report to the Greenwich Police Department. And in true Greenwich fashion, the department handed it off to the state's attorney, and they washed their hands of it. There is a lot going on at this point in time, so we're going to kind of bounce back and forth. But while this was happening, Rushton Skakel made a bold, spectacularly stupid move. He hired Sutton Associates, a very, very high-end private investigation firm, publicly. The story was that Rushton wanted to clear the family name. Privately, it feels like he wanted a blueprint for damage control in case shit hit the fan, and boy, would shit hit the fan. Sutton Associates did what the Greenwich Police Department refused to do in 1975. They actually investigated the Skakel children, and their investigation spanned over several years. Shockingly, they discovered new information that did not bode well for the Skakels. Here's another shocker. Both Michael and Thomas changed their stories. Let's start with Tommy. Remember, he originally claimed that he said goodnight to Martha sometime around 9:30, and he then went inside to do some assignment on Abraham Lincoln and watch The French Connection with Ken Littleton. That was already sketchy considering the teacher he claimed assigned the Lincoln paper said that never happened, and the idea that Thomas Skakel would voluntarily do homework on a party night is honestly funnier than it is suspicious. But during the Sutton interviews, Tommy drops the whole good boy alibi and admits that he and Martha made out and fooled around until around 9:50 p.m., right around the time police believed Martha was killed. So yeah, that's not nothing. But Michael decided to take the chaos dial and rip it the fuck off because his claim is going to get crazy. Michael now claimed that after he came back from his cousin's house, he went to the Moxley home, climbed a tree, and threw pebbles at Martha's window. When she didn't answer, he says he stayed in the tree, and this is going to be really gross, so trigger warning, and masturbated right above the spot where Martha's body was later found. I'm just going to repeat that for the people in the back. Michael put himself at the scene of the murder alone at night near where her body was found, and the best explanation he could come up with was he was jerking off in a fucking tree. Len Levitt reported these updates in Newsday, and suddenly Greenwich police had a new suspect. Somebody that should have been a fucking suspect the entire time. The Sutton team documented everything, they packaged it up, they prepped a report, gave it to the Skakels, and the Skakels said, yeah, we're fucking good. Here's where Dominic Dunn, chaos distributor in the best of ways, enters the scene. And this is where it really spirals. So the Skakels shelved the Sutton report because why wouldn't they? It did not bode well for them. But it still managed to get into the hands of Dominic Dunn, whose daughter Dominique was murdered in 1982. Dunn was already deep in crime coverage and had built a really solid name for himself by exposing privilege, violence, and how the two intersect. So the second he saw the Sutton material, he passed a copy to Detective Frank Garr and said he wouldn't share it publicly, which in Dominic Dunn speak means I'm absolutely going to make sure the right people see this. Dunn also called up a buddy of his from the O.J. Simpson trial, a disgraced ex-cop who was disgraced for his blatant racism, to be honest. And he did also have a reputation for screwing up high-profile cases. But he, at the same time, still knew how to conduct investigations really well. I just think it's important to note that he has a fucked up past, which can obviously, when you're racist, you have inherent biases. It can impact an investigation. Nonetheless, he did investigate this case and ended up being helpful. I just felt it was important to note his past. And anyways, that's how Mark Fuhrman got involved. So Mark Fuhrman, full disclosure, is the racist ex-LAPD cop who torched his own credibility during the O.J. Simpson trial, and that is something society should not ever forget about. But in the world of rich white crime, he was like a dog with a bone, and with the Martha Moxley case, he did not let go. Dunn pushed Fuhrman to write a book, hoping that the public pressure might do what Greenwich police never could, force somebody to actually do their job. So Fuhrman dug into every document, every contradiction, and every new angle that had emerged since 1975, including the confessions that started pouring out of the one place no one had bothered to look before. The subject of the troubled teen industry, including Elon School, deserves its own episode at the very least, so my next episode will be on that. But for now, suffice it to say that the Elon School in Poland, Maine was one of the most critical pieces in moving this case forward. However, it was just a fucking demonic hellscape. It was marketed as a therapeutic boarding school, but in reality, it was a trauma factory disguised as a reform program. Kids sent there weren't just troubled, they were thrown away by parents who wanted results, not rehab. Isolation, humiliation, forced boxing matches, and psychological abuse weren't side effects, they were the curriculum of this institution. And unfortunately for Michael Skakel, he spent 2 years there as a teenager from 1978 to 1980. Several former residents would subsequently testify that Michael either directly confessed to or alluded to murdering Martha. While Skakel was a resident at the school, he was frequently confronted and interrogated about his involvement in Martha Moxley's murder. One of the things that they would have to participate in while enrolled at the school was group therapy sessions, which were supervised by a staff member and would have typically 8 residents involved in the group therapy session. A resident named Charles noted that there were 2 or 3 times within these sessions that they had probed Michael about Martha's murder. And at one point, he kind of responded with annoyance that he was being asked about it. But on the other occasions, Michael would become very upset, even cried, and stated that he didn't know if he had done it. He had also stated at some point in these group sessions that on the night of Martha's murder, he was, quote, blind drunk and stumbling. Another resident of the school named Dorothy testified that on one occasion when she and Michael were talking at a school function, a social function, that he told her that he had been drinking on the night of her murder and that he could not remember whether or not he was involved in Martha's death. He further said to her that his family had actually enrolled him there because it was a possibility that he had murdered Martha, and they wanted him in a location that was far removed from Greenwich's investigating officers. Another resident named Gregory, who lived there from 78 to 80 alongside Michael, testified about an exchange that he had with Michael while he was standing guard over Michael. So what had happened was, this was actually something that happened a lot because Elon School was just a fucking terrible place, as people would run away. Michael ran away, he was brought back, and part of his punishment was that somebody had to stand guard over him, and he had to kind of stay on a platform in the cafeteria. And so Gregory just so happened to be the person in charge of standing guard over him. So they had a lot of conversations. And during one conversation, Skakel had confided in Gregory about murdering a girl who rejected his advances. According to Gregory, Skakel had admitted to killing the girl with a golf club in a wooded area, and that the force that he had hit her with actually caused the golf club to break in half, and that he had returned to the body 2 days later and masturbated on it. We know that that can't be true because Martha's body was discovered within about a 12-hour window from when the murder happened. And also, thankfully, there was no semen or any other evidence of sexual assault found on Martha. But I think it really is interesting that he mentioned the golf club and how it was broken into pieces because he had hit her so hard with it. Another resident named John talked about a few different really emotional admissions that Skakel had made to him while both of them were on guard duty one night on the porch of the men's dorm at the school. So that was Michael's assigned job, and they just had to make sure that nobody was doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. John said that Michael had told him that there was a party at their house the night of the murder. And he also told him that he remembered kind of rummaging through his garage looking for a golf club. He then mentioned something about running through the woods with the club and seeing pine trees. John further stated that as the conversation progressed, that Michael's acknowledgement of his culpability in Martha's murder progressed from, I don't really remember whether I did it, to I may have done it, to I did it. So as he was kind of talking to him more and more, he just full on ended up confessing to the murder. 2 other former residents named Elizabeth and Alice both attended while Michael was there. Both of them also testified that he had made statements about the murder, but he was kind of uncertain as to whether he had did it or if Tommy had done it. Elizabeth said that during a group therapy session, when Michael was questioned about the murder, he said that he was very drunk and had some sort of blackout that night, and that his brother had fooled around with his girlfriend and that his brother had stolen her from him. Alice, who graduated from the program in 78 and then became a staff member while Skakel was there, she said that while she was employed, that Skakel stated that he was not in his normal state on the night of the murder. So Michael left the school in 1980. In the summer of 1987, he had another resident that he knew, also named Michael, stay with him temporarily. When he stayed with him, he said that Michael Skakel told him that on the night of Martha's murder, he had climbed a tree on the Moxley property and masturbated in the tree while watching Martha through her window, which is just a depraved admission, even if it's true or not. Just to say that out loud is just, there's a lot to say about that. And according to Michael, not Skakel, the Michael that was staying with him, he had never heard of Martha Moxley's murder until Skakel told him about this. And allegedly, Skakel also told him that while he was in the tree, he saw his brother Thomas walk across the Moxley property towards her home, but that Thomas had not seen him in the tree. In 1991, when he ran into his friend named Andrew, he also recounted this same story to him when they came across each other. According to Andrew, Skakel had expressed that he wanted to renew their friendship, which gradually had faded after Martha's murder. And in an effort to kind of ease Andrew's concerns about his involvement in Martha's death, he assured him that he didn't kill her, but he did mention that he masturbated in a tree on the night that she was murdered. The craziest part about this particular admission was that Skakel said that that was the tree under which Martha's body was discovered. I'm not so sure that that made Andrew feel any better. I'd imagine it probably made him feel much worse. Were these confessions legally airtight? Not even close. And I think there is something to be said about the admissions in these group therapy sessions. If you're just looking at the troubled teen industry and the shit that Elon School did, I know that they forced a lot of people to do and say a lot of terrible things. So I think there's something to be said about the potential credibility or lack thereof of those admissions. But when you combine that with all of the other admissions, particularly the ones that came decades later and were consistent with all of the other ones, it's certainly hard to ignore. And I think when you have a case that has basically zero DNA, zero fingerprints, and just decades of cover-ups, this was the first time anyone besides the Moxley family had something resembling a smoking gun. Remember how I said that there is a lot that goes on at the same time? So we have Fuhrman deep diving into all of the files and interviewing ex-students, and everybody else doing an investigation. And then Michael decided to do something incredibly on brand for Skakel, talking a lot to the wrong people for the wrong reasons. At some point in the late 90s, Michael started recording hours of audio for a potential book project with a ghostwriter. These tapes, which are now known as the Hoffman tapes, were supposed to be introspective, if you will. What they became was Exhibit A for dumbass self-incrimination. The most descriptive account of Skakel's activities on the night of the murder came in 97, specifically from one of the tape-recorded conversations between himself and Richard Hoffman. This was the writer who was collaborating with him to write a book about his life. So in this admission, he talks about what we already know, that they were sitting in the car before Thomas showed up and rained on his parade. He invited Martha to go to his cousin's house to watch Monty Python Flying Circus. She declined because of her curfew, and they made plans to go trick-or-treating the next night. He then left to go to Dowdall's home. Remember, that's Terrian's new name for whatever reason, alongside Rushton Skakel Jr. and John Skakel. He then told Hoffman that after he came home from his cousin's house, he had walked through the home to see if there were people home. Upon observing that the door to his sister Julie's room was closed, he had remembered that her friend, Andrea Shakespeare, had gone home. He then said that he went into the main bedroom. The television was on, but there was nobody inside of the room. He then went upstairs to bed, but shortly after, according to him, he became horny and decided to spy on a lady who lived on Walsh Lane, which is where Martha lived. He then snuck out of his house and went to this person's home, hoping to see her through the window. He was unsuccessful in that endeavor, so he was like, fuck this. Martha likes me. I'll go get a kiss from Martha. He then proceeded to go to her home, climbed a tree near her door, and masturbated in the tree for about 30 seconds. According to him, he then had a moment of clarity, and he climbed down from the tree and walked back home. On his way home, he threw rocks into the dark, repeatedly yelling, "Who's in there?" He and his friends previously had done this while they were shooting BB guns into the dark. He then said that the next morning he awoke to Dorothy, Martha's mom, saying, "Michael, have you seen Martha?" If you remember, in part 1, I mentioned that Dorothy had noticed that Michael wasn't at school. He looked disheveled, but he didn't look like he had just woken up. So, who knows? He then told Hoffman that he thought to himself, "Oh my God, did they see me last night?" He then told Hoffman that he remembered feeling a sense of panic. Why would you feel a sense of panic if you didn't do anything wrong? I mean, voyeurism like that, being a peeping Tom, is obviously wrong, but why would he be panicking about Martha being missing? So just to quickly recap, in his own words, he admitted being at the exact location where Martha's body was found, alone, after midnight, and the reason we're supposed to believe this wasn't suspicious is because he was horny? Let's call it what it is. Michael panicked. He knew too much, said too much, and thought confessing to jerking off outside her window would somehow make him less suspicious. It didn't. I want to pivot back to Greenwich police formally reopening the investigation. And obviously, once this was done, a lot came to the surface, including how poorly Greenwich police handled the investigation. In part 2, I talked about 2 junior officers, Jones and Hickman. Well, Officer Hickman was supposed to stay with Martha's body while Officer Jones went inside to use the phone to call headquarters. Actually, instead of doing that, Officer Hickman panicked, ran to his patrol car, and started frantically making calls on the radio. Meanwhile, Captain Keegan showed up on scene and found a dog licking the blood trail that led to Martha's body. And what was Officer Hickman doing? Petting the dog. He was literally petting the dog while it was eating evidence. So, great. They did really just such a stand-up job. Another really big issue and conflict of interest was something that was common practice with Greenwich police is they would work off-duty for people in the neighborhood, including the Skakels. So they would be employed by the Skakels to do private security, which is obviously a conflict of interest. And if somebody's paying you a shit ton of money, are you really going to be unbiased when they're involved in an investigation? I think not, even if you went into it with great intentions. And there's just no way. Mark Fuhrman was able to uncover a lot of information from the Sutton report and other files, but by far the most telling was a report written by a Detroit homicide detective named Gerald Hale. Greenwich police ended up bringing in Gerald Hale to evaluate the case and to give advice. According to that, Helen and Jeff told police that Martha and Thomas were roughhousing. We already knew that, and that he had either pushed Martha down and got on her, or she fell down and he got on top of her. Either way, the activity started with roughhousing. Additionally, according to the report, Martha's body was found around 200 feet southwest of her home. Martha was laying face down partially under a large tree that is part of a clump of evergreen trees, and her head was facing east. So Hale believed that the initial assault likely took place around 40 feet into the west exit of the driveway because that's where a small amount of blood was found in that location. 40 feet southwest, there were 2 larger pools of blood found, and to him this indicated that this is likely where most of the assault occurred, and likely this is where it was fatal. Following these 2 pools, there were drag marks that zigzagged through the grass to underneath the tree where Martha was found. The report further stated that the 11-inch piece of golf club shaft was found near the 2 large pools of blood, which was the head of the 6-iron Tony Penna golf club, and an 8-inch piece of the shaft that were found 60 to 70 feet northeast of the site of the initial attack in the driveway. He had felt that the pieces of club were actually thrown to where they were found. The report left several questions. Martha was in the corner of the property. Why would her killer throw the pieces of the golf clubs in the direction of the home and not somewhere off the property? If they did throw the pieces like Hale surmised in his report, why weren't any fingerprints successfully recovered? Why did Greenwich police waste so much time trying to find the missing pieces of the golf club when they recovered pieces that were likely the same pieces that killed Martha? And they were able to identify that the other club in the rare Tony Penna set was in the Skakel home. Martha didn't have any defensive wounds, which meant that Martha was surprised by the attack. Noting the first few small drops of blood found in the exit of the driveway, it could suggest that Martha was attacked right before she was able to get into her home. This would probably indicate that her attacker would have known that Martha would be there. Maybe her killer was walking her home, or maybe the killer followed her home from where she was. Mark Fuhrman's book Murder in Greenwich came out in 1998, and after Garr and Solomon built their cases with the Sutton info, Elon School testimonies, and Michael's own mouth handing them everything but a signed confession, in June of 1998, a very rarely invoked one-man grand jury was convened to review all of the evidence of Martha's case. After 18 months of investigating, a decision was made that there was enough evidence to charge Michael Skakel of Martha Moxley's murder. On February 8th, 2000, Michael Skakel was charged with murder, and the next day he turned himself in. He was living in Florida, so he had to fly to Connecticut. He pleaded not guilty and was released shortly after on $500,000 bail. His wife, Margot, filed for divorce shortly after he was arrested for her murder. On March 14th, Michael was arraigned as a juvenile since he was 15 at the time of the murder. However, on January 31st of 2001, a judge did rule that he would be tried as an adult. There's a lot that goes on throughout the year, so I'm going to throw a couple of dates at you in and out of trial. We're going to talk about the trial and everything that came after. One date that stood out to me was March 14th of 2000 when he was arraigned. He approached Dorothy in court and said, "You've got the wrong guy." I don't know. I feel like he has a lot of balls for that, but it is Michael Skakel we're talking about. So August 17th of 2000 is when Judge Maureen Dennis ruled that there is sufficient evidence to proceed with the trial, and that's when they ordered the investigation as to whether he should be tried as an adult. January 31st, Judge Dennis ordered the case to be transferred to Superior Court. April 19th of 2001, that's when Gregory Coleman testified. He is one of the individuals that attended Elon School and Skakel confessed to. And he admitted that he was high on heroin when he testified before the grand jury. When he did testify, high as fuck, he said that Skakel said that he would get away with murder because he was a Kennedy. On August 7th of 2001, he was found dead in Rochester, New York after overdosing. On November 19th of 2001, Connecticut Supreme Court denied his appeal to transfer the case to Superior Court. They stated that that issue couldn't be appealed until the trial was over. On December 11th of 2001, Superior Court Judge John Kavaniewski Jr. rejected the defense's argument that a statute of limitations applies to the case. April 24th of 2002, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were completed, and on May 7th, 2002, the testimony began. The trial began on May 7th in Norwalk, Connecticut, and Michael Skakel was represented by attorney Michael Sherman, and he maintained the alibi that he was at his cousin's home at the time of the murder. During the trial, the jury was able to listen to the entirety of that taped book proposal, and this included the portion of Michael speaking about masturbating in a tree over Martha's home on the night of her murder, which potentially was the same tree that her body was found under the next morning. While he never formally admitted to the murder in the recording, it was compelling nonetheless. He also admitted in the recording that he was scared that he might have been seen that night, like I mentioned before, and that caused him to panic. Prosecution rested on May 21st, and the defense rested on May 28th. I want to talk about the closing arguments because there are going to be several appeals with several different reasons. During closing arguments, the prosecution used multimedia as a presentation for their closing arguments, which is a thing that you are allowed to do. And he later brings that up during an appeal as a reason for his appeal. During Dorothy's victim impact statement, she said that Michael Skakel sentenced us to a life without Martha. On June 7th of 2002, Michael Skakel was found guilty of murdering Martha, and on August 9th of 2002, he was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He was sent to the Garner Correctional Institution, which is located in Newtown, Connecticut. I've said this a couple times. Michael would go on to appeal his conviction multiple times, eventually becoming successful thanks to his cousin RFK Jr. And again, in his initial appeal, he included the fact that the prosecution used multimedia during their closing arguments, claiming that they were distorting evidence. Let's fast forward to January of 2003. RFK Jr. wrote a controversial article for the Atlantic Monthly titled A Miscarriage of Justice, and he accused Ken Littleton of the murder by suggesting there was way more evidence that he had killed Martha. That's completely untrue. There never was any evidence of Ken Littleton killing Martha, and he later retracts this in his book, which I'm going to talk about. So there's that. In November of 2003, Skakel appealed to the Connecticut Supreme Court that the court erred because the case really should have been in juvenile court, that the statute of limitations expired on the charges, and he also alleged prosecutorial misconduct. On January 12th of 2006, the court rejected his claims and affirmed the conviction. Skakel subsequently retained former United States Solicitor General Theodore Olson, and he filed a petition for judicial review on July 12th of 2006. November 13th of 2006, the Connecticut Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Fast forward to 2007, Skakel had new attorneys, and they filed petitions for a writ of habeas corpus, which, if you've been watching the news, I'm sure you've heard that come up about 10,000 times, and a motion for a new trial in the trial court that originally heard his case based on a new theory that emerged. So once RFK Jr. got involved in this, everything just fucking turned into a shit show. And I'm going to talk about a book that was published by him in 2016. But one of the first things his team did when they got involved in this case was dig up a story from a man named Gaetano Tony Bryant. Tony was a former classmate of Michael Skakel's and allegedly Kobe Bryant's cousin, although this has absolutely never been confirmed or substantiated. In fact, Tony is known to be a bit of a liar, so take that as you will. Tony claimed that on the night of Martha's murder, he had two friends from New York City visiting, Adolph Hasbrook and Burr Tinsley. Neither of these men were white. Adolph is a black man, and Burr, I believe, was indigenous as well as another ethnicity, though it wasn't entirely clear. Suffice it to say, this would be RFK Jr.'s way of saying, hey, it's not my rich white cousin. It is very obviously this black man and his friend who's also not white. This is something that he, rightfully so, has come under fire for and came under fire for again last year when he received his nomination for Trump's cabinet, which I'm not going to get into politics. I'm just saying it got mucked up again and people started talking about it. It is important to note, I'm going to talk about this more, there's zero fucking evidence implicating these men. Same thing with zero evidence implicating Ken Littleton. Here's what Tony said. They all snuck into Belle Haven together that night. Remember, there was increased security that evening. And while they were there, Adolph and Burr told him that they were planning to get a girl and they were going to leave her caveman style. According to Tony, he told them not to do anything and then left them behind and never saw them again conveniently. He didn't witness any crime, he didn't report anything, and he didn't mention this story to anyone until over 2 decades later, after Michael had already been convicted and after he was found by RFK Jr. and his team. Tony kept quiet, according to him, because his mother told him not to get involved and because he didn't want to be connected to a murder case that had the Kennedy name stamped all over it. But here's the part that's really insulting. Tony Bryant didn't testify under oath. The court ruled that his statements weren't admissible because they were hearsay. The confession, allegedly, from Adolph and Burr was never confirmed. In fact, both of them denied it and said they had never been to Greenwich. They weren't even in the state. So what RFK Jr. did was take this flimsy, unverified story from a guy with Kennedy ties whose credibility was built entirely on vibes and use it as a foundation for his media campaign. He spun it into articles, gave interviews about it, and pushed it in front of anybody who'd listen as if it were a missing piece of the puzzle. But it wasn't a missing piece, it was a decoy. Behind the scenes, RFK Jr. didn't just stop at planting stories in the press. He also arranged a secret meeting with Dorothy Moxley in her own home, in what could only be described as a guilt-flavored PR ambush. According to Dorothy, RFK Jr. showed up and told her that Michael was innocent. He brought up the Tony Bryant story, painted it as truth, and tried to convince her that her daughter's real killers were still out there, and that she'd been fighting the wrong person all along. And to her credit, Dorothy wasn't buying it. She told him flat out, Michael never came forward, not for 20 years. He didn't say, I didn't do it. He didn't offer up the truth. He just lied. The meeting went nowhere, but RFK Jr. did not stop. Every single time that Michael Skakel had shot himself in the foot, RFK Jr. spun that and tried to sell it as misunderstood trauma. And as absurd and insulting as it was, RFK Jr.'s campaign worked. His profile and the Kennedy name gave legitimacy to a defense that had already been shredded in court. It didn't matter that his alternative suspects had ironclad alibis. It didn't matter that his so-called witnesses changed their stories repeatedly. It didn't matter that the entire narrative was constructed around protecting somebody who admitted, in his own voice, to being exactly where the victim was killed. Because at the end of the day, RFK Jr. didn't need to win the truth. He just needed to create enough doubt. And when the state finally dropped the case, it wasn't because they found the real killer. It was because Skakel's team successfully made the truth too muddy to prosecute. This wasn't justice, it was white-collar sabotage. Martha's diary noted Tony Bryant twice in January of 1975, which isn't surprising because he went to school with the Skakels. But it doesn't mention him after, and it never once mentions Burr or Adolf. So Kennedy endorsed this testimony in 2007, but it was rejected by Stamford Superior Court Judge Edward R. Karazin Jr. because he said that Bryant's testimony wasn't credible. Skakel then appealed based on incompetence against his lead attorney in his original trial. In April of 2013, they had a hearing, and he was granted a new trial by CT Judge Thomas Bishop, Boo, who ruled that his attorney failed to represent him adequately. He was then released on November 21st of 2013 on a $1.2 million bond, along with being monitored with a GPS device, no contact with the Moxley family, periodic phone check-ins, and he wasn't allowed to leave the state unless he was granted permission. In December of 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated his conviction with a 4-3 majority decision stating that his conviction was due to the overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors and that his legal representation was in fact adequate. But like I said earlier in the episode, RFK Jr. planted the seeds of doubt and muddied the waters. In January of 2018, prosecutors asked the Supreme Court to revoke his bail and return him to prison to finish serving his sentence. On May 4th, the Supreme Court vacated his conviction and ordered a new trial, ruling that his lawyer actually had rendered ineffective assistance because he failed to contact an alibi witness whose name was provided by Skakel, and as a result, he was deprived of a fair trial. On October 30th of 2020, Chief State's Attorney Richard Colangelo informed Connecticut Superior Court that Skakel would not be retried because the state would not be able to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. On April 18th of 2023, Michael Skakel filed a lawsuit against Greenwich and the police department compelling the return of the so-called Hoffman tapes. Again, these are the recordings he made with that writer for a book that never ended up getting published. His legal team said there were concerns that it could be picked up by tabloids or made into a movie. Not clear if the tapes still exist, they may have been discarded. Nobody knows. On October 30th of 2023, he again sued Greenwich, along with the police department and the lead investigator in the criminal case against him, claiming improper procedures that sent him to jail. This was filed in Connecticut Superior Court, and it named Frank Garr as the lead investigator. On December 6th of 2024, lawyers for the town served Skakel an order that he must answer questions under oath related to the case. The lawsuit is seeking compensation as if he's not fucking rich enough and punitive damages for his imprisonment. and it is currently ongoing. So why are we still talking about this case almost 50 years later? I feel like nobody agrees on what justice even looks like here. For Martha's family, justice was too little too late, and it was incomplete. For the Skakels, justice was an inconvenience that they threw money at until it went away. And for RFK Jr., it was a conspiracy where his cousin was framed because reasons. And to me, that's what makes this case so fucking frustrating, even with a conviction, even with jail time, even with multiple court rulings. The money machine still managed to flip the script and make Skakel the victim. Meanwhile, Martha is permanently 15, buried under layers of legal loopholes and privilege-driven PR spins. Now, let's ask the question that nobody in Belle Haven wanted to answer in 1975. If Martha Moxley had been born into the Skakel Kennedy family instead of just living next door, would this case have been solved in a year? I think we all know the answer. If a 15-year-old Kennedy cousin was beaten to death with a golf club in their own yard, the killer wouldn't have had 25 years of freedom. The full weight of the American justice system would have come crashing down within weeks. But Martha wasn't a Skakel. She was just the girl next door, and that made all of the difference. Justice in America isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about who you are, what your last name is, and how much power you have to bend the rules. And if you're born into the wrong tax bracket, if you're born not white, guess what? You're going to be just another case file gathering dust until somebody decides you're worth remembering again. And that is a really sad, bitter pill that we all have to swallow daily with our fucked up criminal justice system. Martha deserved better, just like everybody else whose case was thrown to the wind. And that is why we should still be talking about her case today. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please like, review, subscribe. You can find me on TikTok. I do weekly live streams, fthatpod, Instagram, fthat_pod. If you want access to all of my episodes early and ad-free, as well as bonus episodes and archived episodes, find me on Patreon, fthatpod. Website is fthatpod.com, and there is sweet, sweet merch on there.